The photograph exists. George V and Queen Mary, surrounded by their children, formally composed. The monarchy projecting itself as family. Love restrained into occasion. Dynasty presenting as domestic life. It was carefully constructed. Outside, in the country, ordinary people looked at such images and found them reassuring. Harold Nicolson, the official biographer of George V, made a specific pilgrimage in 1949. He traveled to York Cottage, the house on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where 5 of the 6 children had been born, where the family had lived for 33 years. He recorded in his diary that it was almost incredible that this heir to so vast a heritage lived in this horrible little house. James Pope-Hennessy, commissioned to write Queen Mary's biography in 1955, visited in 1956, and wrote that York Cottage has to be seen to be believed. The Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, the eldest after the abdication, told Nicolson directly, "Until you have seen York Cottage, you will never understand my father." The house is now the Sandringham Estate Office. Sally Bedell Smith, researching her biography of George VI, was shown around it in 2019 by the deputy land agent Simon Hickling. What remained after its conversion to offices was enough. Pinched hallways, shockingly small rooms, an atmosphere of compressed domesticity that the house's subsequent biographers found difficult to reconcile with what was supposed to have been happening inside it. George V described it himself as 3 cheerful English pubs joined together, which tells you more about his aesthetic sensibility than about the house. Queen Mary found it cramped and endured it for 3 decades. The biographers found it dismaying. The children had no frame of reference for anything else. York Cottage is where this story begins, because it's where the distance between official image and private reality is most precisely measurable. Queen Mary's children didn't grow up in a home. They grew up in a system. The nurseries were staffed by servants who had more daily contact with the children than their parents did. The schedules were fixed, parental visits formal, brief, and timed rather than spontaneous. Emotion was managed before it could be expressed, and the management began earlier than anyone outside the household understood. Their father believed children should be obedient, useful, and afraid enough to comply. Their mother believed the monarchy survived precisely when private feeling was subordinated to public duty. Between them, they built 6 children, one of whom they eventually housed separately on the grounds that the main household couldn't accommodate what he was. Edward rebelled. Bertie trembled. Mary withdrew. Henry took orders. George ran. And behind all of them stood Queen Mary, upright, jeweled, watchful, and constitutionally certain that the crown's claim on her children outweighed any individual need they might have. They feared disappointing her not because she was cruel in any obvious way. They feared disappointing her because they understood, precisely and without illusion, what she valued most. And it wasn't them. George V and Queen Mary had 6 children, not 5. The 6th is usually omitted from family portraits and popular accounts, and his omission is itself an argument about what the system could absorb. Prince John Charles Francis was born July 12, 1905, the youngest, and epileptic. His seizures grew more severe through childhood. By approximately 1909, he had been moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, separated from the main household, in the care of Charlotte Bill, his nurse. He lived there until his death on January 18, 1919, a Thursday afternoon, following a severe seizure at 13 years old. George V wrote in his diary of, "Our poor little Johnny." Queen Mary's response was recorded as dreadfully sad. The 5 older children were born between 1894 and 1902. Edward in June 1894 at White Lodge, Richmond Park. Albert in December 1895 at York Cottage. Mary in August 1897 at York Cottage. Henry in March 1900. George in December 1902. All but Edward arrived in that cramped house in Norfolk, in their mother's bedroom, in conditions that would later astonish the biographers who came to document them. From birth, the foundational structural fact of their childhood was simple. Their parents weren't their primary carers. Servants were. This wasn't aberrant by the standards of its era. Victorian and Edwardian aristocratic households routinely employed nannies and governesses for this purpose. Parents in that stratum supervised children rather than raised them directly. The Windsors weren't unusual for employing nurses. What made their nursery different wasn't the structure, it was what happened inside it. The first nurse employed by the Duke and Duchess of York was hired around the time of Edward's birth in June 1894. Her name remains genuinely uncertain. The historical record offers 3 candidates, Mrs. Green, Mary Peters, and Mary Peterson, and no definitive identity has been established. What is established, across multiple biographical accounts, is the pattern of what she did for approximately 3 years. She deliberately pinched young Edward before parental visits. The mechanism was precise. A weeping infant handed to his mother would be removed from the room. The visit would end. The nanny's authority over the nursery would remain undisturbed for another day. Queen Mary saw her eldest son twice a day during his infancy, in scheduled visits rather than spontaneous contact. Pope-Hennessy's 1959 biography records that she didn't find it easy to express her emotions, and multiple biographical accounts describe her as genuinely uncomfortable with children, including her own. A mother who found physical warmth difficult, receiving a screaming infant, would naturally remove the child. The nanny understood the mechanism. Edward spent the first 3 years of his life being made to cry before seeing his mother. The second son, Albert, Bertie to the family, George VI to history, suffered differently. He was born December 14, 1895, a date that created immediate dynastic unease. Queen Victoria had declared December 14th a day of mourning for Prince Albert, dead since 1861, and the coincidence required careful management of a grandmother's response. The new arrival was already, in his first hours, a logistical problem for someone else's grief. When Bertie was old enough to begin eating solid food, the nurse would snatch the bowl from him at mealtimes, telling the under-nurse, Charlotte Bill, that he had quite enough. Then, at other times, she would overfeed him until he became ill. Possessive attention toward Edward combined with deliberate neglect and physical cruelty toward Bertie, that was the pattern multiple biographical accounts describe. The under-nurse, Charlotte Bill, watched the bowl snatched day after day and understood she was observing something systematically wrong. Imagine the room, the nursery at York Cottage, a cramped space on one of the upper floors, the muffled Norfolk quiet outside. Bill, 21 years old in April 1897, when she had been appointed, watching the nurse's hand pull the bowl from a toddler who hadn't finished eating, and the toddler absorbing this as the ordinary order of things. Children at that age have no category for abuse. They only have experience. Bertie's experience, in those foundational years, was that food arrived unpredictably, that hunger wasn't reliably answered, that the woman in charge of him operated by rules he couldn't anticipate or understand. Edward's experience was that crying produced removal from maternal contact. These early lessons, that emotional display backfires, that basic needs are managed arbitrarily, were installed before either child could form language adequate to describe them. Charlotte Bill eventually reported what she had observed, communicating through a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary. The confrontation with the first nurse produced a breakdown. She was dismissed immediately and subsequently, reportedly, committed to an institution. 3 years of systematic abuse in the nursery of the future King of England, And it ended not because the parents detected it. Queen Mary's twice-daily visits had been successfully defeated by manufactured tears, but because a junior household employee was paying closer attention than anyone else. Bill, called Lala within the family, was elevated to principal nurse. She was warm and genuinely attached to the children she raised. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was particularly close to her throughout his childhood and adolescence. She cared for Prince John at Wood Farm until his death in 1919. When Edward abdicated in December 1936, she wrote to the palace, plaintive in the accounts, the response of a woman who had loved these children with a consistency the household structure had not always supported. In every functional sense, Charlotte Bill was the emotional mother of the Windsor children in their early years. The biological mother visited twice daily, found infants difficult, and spent those years being handed a screaming son she didn't understand was being prepared for her. Military culture was the only institutional language George V fully understood, and he applied it to his children with the consistency of a man who believed structure was itself a form of love. He had entered the Royal Navy at 12 years old in September 1877, serving on HMS Britannia at Dartmouth, alongside his elder brother Albert Victor. Over 15 years he sailed to the Caribbean, South Africa, Australia, East Asia, Japan, commanding successively Torpedo Boat 79, HMS Thrush, and HMS Melampus. He left the service only in 1892, when Albert Victor's death from influenza pulled him out of the Navy and into the line of succession. Naval hierarchy, the expectation of precise obedience as a structural requirement, the understanding that performance was always being assessed, these were the formative systems of his adult life, and he subsequently applied them to his household with the thoroughness of a commanding officer who couldn't imagine any other way of organizing people who depended on him. Jane Ridley, whose 2021 biography, George V, Never a Dull Moment, is the most recent scholarly treatment, documents that George V bullied and beat his children. His quick temper terrorized his offspring. Children in the royal household, across multiple historical accounts, lived on edge, in fear of their father's retribution. Serious misdemeanors resulted in a formal summons to the library. Not a conversation, but something closer to a judicial proceeding, conducted in a formal room behind a closed door, with all the implication of verdict attached. He wasn't without genuine principle. When two of his sons once rode past estate laborers without acknowledging them, George V halted them, wheeled them round, and made them return to the two astonished men, from whom the boys then received elaborate apologies. His contempt for aristocratic arrogance toward ordinary people was authentic and lifelong. The same instinct applied to every aspect of his son's conduct with the consistency of a man who recognized no boundary between institutional responsibility and domestic authority, produced a household atmosphere that multiple biographers describe as one of sustained dread. His letters to his sons were formal documents of instruction to David on becoming Prince of Wales in 1911. The requirement to always remember that now you must always set a good example to the others by being very obedient, respectful to your seniors, and kind to everyone. Obedient is the first quality named. Respectful to seniors is the second. Kindness comes third, as an afterthought about conduct toward those beneath them. Kenneth Rose, in his biography, King George V, records George V telling Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in 1934, 2 years before his death, that, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." Edward was 40 years old when his father delivered this verdict to the Prime Minister. It wasn't an expression of paternal worry. It was a settled prediction, stated with the certainty of long observation, shared not with the family, but with the government. George V showed warmth toward his grandchildren, particularly Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II, whom he called Lilibet and treated with conspicuous affection. Contemporaries noted it. Multiple accounts document it. The contrast between his manner toward his sons and his manner toward his granddaughter was striking enough to register widely. The warmth existed. It found its way to a second generation, while the first was still managing its wounds. A famous quotation circulates in which George V allegedly described a generational chain of fathers frightening their children, claiming his own children would fear him as he had feared his father. That quotation was attributed in a 1959 source and has since been shown to be fabricated, apocryphal, not an actual statement of George V's. The documented record makes the point without any invention. His own father, Edward VII, had thought it a mistake to treat children too severely or strictly. George V was stricter than Edward VII. This was a deliberate departure from a father's explicit example, not a cultural default inherited without reflection. Queen Mary's coldness requires more careful reading than her husband's, because it wasn't inherited and not simple. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, enormous, exuberant, financially ruinous, and thoroughly warm. She spent more time with her children than many women of her rank did, organized musical evenings at White Lodge, and played with genuine delight in her children's company. She was, by every account, the opposite of reserved. She was also financially catastrophic. The Tech family perennially lived beyond their means, the instability coloring every aspect of Queen Mary's girlhood. The household at Kensington Palace was affectionate and chaotic in approximately equal measure. The daughter who emerged from that household chose control as the countermeasure to chaos. Emotional expressiveness was what her mother did, freely and with no apparent thought for consequences. What Queen Mary built was its near opposite, a self-governing composure so thoroughgoing that Pope-Hennessy, with access to private papers and dozens of courtier interviews that no other biographer had, concluded she didn't find it easy to express her emotions. His 1959 biography, still regarded as the foundational account of her life, traces the public self with extraordinary precision. The private self is nearly invisible in the sources, not because the archival record is thin, but because Queen Mary's diaries and letters give very little away emotionally. She could describe the provenance and condition of a piece of porcelain with the precision of an art historian. Her inner record is almost silent. Some accounts complicate this portrait. One essay on her life notes that she was very badly treated by her father and then her husband, and the early years of her marriage included considerable friction. The composure she subsequently inhabited may have begun as self-protection and become, over decades, a philosophy. The two aren't easy to separate, and the honest biographical position is that her emotional distance was probably both a response to circumstance and a genuine conviction. Less a wound than a worldview, and ultimately indistinguishable from one even to herself. The collector's impulse tells you something real about her. She devoted decades and considerable personal energy to the royal collection. Objects of art, furniture, porcelain, documented provenance, carefully maintained records. She was described, accurately, as one of the most attentive royal collectors in the family's modern history. Objects could be controlled, catalogued, and properly placed. Objects stayed where you put them. People, and particularly her own children, didn't. Her philosophy had a stated form. You are a member of the British royal family. We are never tired, and we always smile. She said this, or variants of it, on multiple recorded occasions, to family members and household staff alike. It wasn't merely a performance note for difficult public days. It was a worldview. The public self was the real self, and the private self's discomforts were simply not the relevant category. Sarah Bradford, in her biography of George VI, names Queen Mary and George V together as Anxious, loving, but unsuccessful parents. The precision of that formulation is worth holding. Not absent, not malicious, but loving in a way that consistently failed to translate into what children could receive as love. At the moment of George V's death on January 20th, 1936, Queen Mary, by one account from within the household, immediately addressed her son Edward as "God save the King." Ceremony before grief in the private room in the first minutes of widowhood. Whether this was conscious or reflex, the instinct was the same. The institution first. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was the first child, born June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, the one suite of rooms spacious enough for the occasion of an heir's arrival. His earliest experience of the maternal visit was manufactured crying that got him removed from the very contact it was supposed to enable. The family system introduced itself to him in those first months as a place where emotional display produced abandonment rather than comfort. At 13, he left York Cottage for the Royal Naval College at Osborne. By 16, he was at Dartmouth. By 17, he was created Prince of Wales. These departures removed him from the household before the household could fully complete its work on him, which may or may not have helped him in ways that the historical record can't fully recover. What Edward became as an adult was personally charming in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed. Francis Donaldson's 1974 biography, the authoritative scholarly treatment of his life, documents his concern for the poor and unemployed during his years as Prince of Wales as apparently authentic. He visited South Wales mining communities, spoke to laborers with what appeared to be real attention, expressed views that alarmed the Foreign Office and worried his advisors. He made people feel individually seen in ways that trained monarchs rarely managed. The charm merits examination alongside the resentment. A child whose distress produced removal, who learned early that emotional display wasn't met with comfort, but with the termination of the very contact he was trying to reach, would develop, if he survived intact, a highly calibrated ability to manage what others felt, to perform warmth without risking the vulnerability that real warmth requires. The performance for strangers was apparently limitless. The performance the institution required, the emotional invisibility that the Windsor Code demanded, the subordination of every preference to ceremony, had a floor, and Edward knew precisely where it was. He also possessed what one account describes as a streak of stubborn arrogance that he could do whatever he wanted. This framing of arrogance may understate the psychology. More precisely, he had developed a capacity for absolute refusal on matters of personal importance, which in a man raised to have no legitimate personal importance looked very much like arrogance to the people he refused. His father recognized it explicitly, stating it to Baldwin in 1934 with the tone of a man who has long since stopped being surprised. The abdication is usually narrated as a love story. The historical record qualifies this substantially. Multiple accounts confirm that the king had already made up his mind to go, even if he couldn't marry Wallis Simpson. Something beyond a romantic occasion was driving him. A man who had spent 4 decades inside a system that claimed his entire person for institutional purposes was, at 42, choosing to exit it. Wallis Simpson was the occasion. The exit was overdetermined by everything that had preceded it. Edward chose his father's birthday as his wedding date in June 1937. One account describes this as unforgivable to Queen Mary. Whether that coincidence was deliberate or careless, it registered. Across the channel, in the palace, in the maternal reading of everything her eldest son did, as an act of meaning. Even from France, even in exile, even married, the family grammar hadn't left him. He still spoke it in the acts that wounded. In his final years, he reportedly described Queen Mary as hard and cruel, with fluids in her veins, as icy cold as they are now in death. This was an old man's verdict after 6 decades of accumulated feeling. It isn't a neutral assessment, but it's data, the distillation of a relationship that the evidence supports reading as one of genuine loss on both sides, in which the institutional framework made mutual recognition very nearly impossible. Albert Frederick Arthur George was born December 14, 1895, and the date required immediate family management. Queen Victoria had declared December 14th Mausoleum Day in mourning for Prince Albert, dead since 1861. The new child was named Albert to soften the Queen's reaction, and it worked. She wrote that he would be more dear to me for sharing the date with her late husband. Bertie arrived into the world as a consolation for someone else's grief, and he spent a great deal of his life in similar territory. He was naturally left-handed, required to write with his right hand. He developed a stammer. He clung to the bottom rung of the scholastic rankings and lived perpetually in the shadow of a brother the household and the outside world consistently found more interesting. His siblings were apparently allowed to ridicule his speech, a detail the speech therapist Caroline Bowen notes specifically in her 2011 review of the biographical record on George VI and Lionel Logue. A boy who stammers, surrounded by siblings who mock the stammer, in a house where George V's wrath for the most trivial of reasons is documented, where clothing errors were enough to provoke visible royal rage, would learn to speak with every possible precaution, and the precaution itself compounds the stammer. The anxiety about being wrong feeds the very symptom the anxiety is responding to. The Sky History historical record, drawing on biographical sources, attributes his stammer specifically to fear of his father. A priggish man obsessed with formality, order, and fearful of scandal. The medical science is less settled than this framing implies. Stammering can arise from neurological and genetic factors independent of psychological environment, and the evidence suggests that about 2/3 of patients who stammer report a family history. Bertie's brother, Prince Henry, reportedly also stammered, though without the same severity or the same documented family response. What isn't in doubt is that Bertie's stammer persisted through adulthood, cost him enormously, and that the household he grew up in wasn't designed to be gentle with visible weakness. In October 1925, as Duke of York, he delivered a speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. By his own assessment, it was traumatic enough to finally prompt action. His wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who had turned down 2 of his marriage proposals before accepting the 3rd in 1923, found Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist practicing at 146 Harley Street, London. Logue had treated soldiers with shell-shock speech disorders during the First World War and had built his London practice since 1924. His approach combined breathing exercises, relaxation, and the consistent encouragement of a man one of his other patients, Richard Orton, recalled decades later as giving him nothing but encouragement. For a prince accustomed to the Windsor household's version of instruction, the library summons, the letters about obedience, the father whose temper required constant vigilance, encouragement without concurrent threat was structurally unfamiliar. Beginning in 1925, Bertie came regularly to Harley Street. His wife accompanied him frequently, learning the breathing exercises so she could help him practice at home. Logue had the Duke standing at an open window, loudly intoning each vowel for 15 seconds. He gave him tongue twisters. He gave him, in Orton's phrasing, the experience of fluency. Bertie opened the Australian Parliament in Canberra in 1927, speaking resonantly and without stammering. He never became comfortable. He improved enough to function, and function was what the system required. When Edward signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, witnessed at Fort Belvedere by Albert, Henry, and George, three brothers gathered in the same room where one of them was renouncing what the others were staying to carry. Bertie reportedly broke down on Queen Mary's shoulder. Pope-Hennessy's unpublished research notes, edited by Hugo Vickers and published as The Quest for Queen Mary in 2018, contain this detail from interviews conducted during his research. It's the portrait of a man who had not prepared himself for kingship because he had never sought it in his imagination, weeping at the precise moment it became unavoidable. He became George VI because duty required it, and because the Windsor Code, internalized through childhood fear and adult compliance, made refusal genuinely unthinkable. Sarah Bradford titled her biography, George VI, The Dutiful King. That title isn't complimentary in any uncomplicated sense. Duty, in this context, means doing what is required at personal cost because you can't conceive of any other response being permissible. His own diary records, in 1940, that a wartime broadcast was easily my best effort. How I hate broadcasting. One sentence, in private notation, that contains the entirety of his kingship in miniature. Measurable improvement, undiminished dread, complete continuation regardless. He died in his sleep on February 6, 1952, of a coronary thrombosis following lung cancer at 56 years old, a heavy smoker from his youth. He had carried 15 years of wartime and Reconstruction on the weight of a man who had always been more afraid than he let anyone see. Princess Mary's history requires some recovery from the thinness of the record she left behind, which is itself significant because the thinness wasn't accidental. She was born August 25, 1897, at York Cottage, the third child, the only daughter, the one whose gender created a different set of institutional requirements and a different form of utility. George V reportedly longed for a daughter after two sons, and when Mary arrived, he found her, by one account, considerably harder to manage once she reached adolescence than his sons had been. The problem being that daughters served different instrumental purposes. They were married outward, not upward, through the succession. Their utility was diplomatic and social rather than hereditary, which meant their formation had different objectives. She was educated by governesses, shared some lessons with her brothers, became fluent in German and French, developed a lifelong passion for horses and horse racing. She first appeared in public at her parents' coronation on June 22, 1911, 13 years old, in a coronet, performing her first official function with the composure the household had trained into her. During the First World War, she worked alongside Queen Mary, hospitals, the Girl Guides, voluntary aid detachments. Her 1914 Christmas gift fund distributed presents worth £100,000 to serving soldiers and sailors, the equivalent of roughly £9.5 million in 2023. She was conspicuously useful in public throughout the war, at every official occasion the household required of her. On February 28, 1922, Princess Mary married Henry Lascelles, Viscount Lascelles, at Westminster Abbey. He was 39 years old. She was 24. The age gap of 15 years generated contemporary rumor that the match had been arranged rather than freely chosen. No primary source confirms this. Queen Mary wrote in letters at the time that Mary is radiant, and declared herself getting so fond of him. The letter is affectionate and proper. Whether the radiance was felt or produced as required by a daughter raised in a household where the correct emotional response was always the public one, at this distance, that is genuinely unanswerable. What is answerable is the trajectory. Mary settled in Yorkshire, She had 2 sons. She carried out charitable work and public service for decades. She became, in the historical record, an uncontroversial figure within the royal family. She wasn't the daughter who caused problems. She wasn't the daughter who refused. She was the daughter who did what was expected, consistently and without visible complaint, until she died of a heart attack during a walk at Harewood House on March 28, 1965, at 67 years old. Her estate valued at £347,626. 6 British monarchs reigned during her lifetime. Her final official engagement before her death was representing the Queen at the funeral of Queen Louise of Sweden in early March 1965. A few weeks later, she visited her brother Edward, the Duke of Windsor, at the London clinic where he was recovering from eye surgery, and met his wife. One of the very few meetings between the Duchess of Windsor and the immediate family in all the decades since the abdication. Then she went home to Yorkshire and died. The cost of her complete accommodation isn't visible in the record, because that is the nature of complete accommodation. You can't see what was suppressed because the suppression was successful. Mary had learned, more thoroughly than any of her brothers, how to become exactly what was required without leaving a visible trace of anything else. The Windsor household's ideal, fully realized. The younger princes inherited positions with less succession pressure, which created different, and in George's case, considerably more vivid possibilities. Prince Henry, Harry within the family, was born March 31, 1900. He was the first son of a British monarch to attend school in the conventional sense. Eton College, then the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He pursued a military career in the British Army with an apparent ease that the other Windsor children didn't find in their institutional paths. George V created him Duke of Gloucester on his 28th birthday in 1928. Pope-Hennessy, spending time with Henry during his research for the Queen Mary biography, described him as totally unpretentious and most engaging. Of all the Windsor children, Henry appears to have found the most straightforward fit between what the household required and what he could naturally provide. Military life being, in its hierarchies and its demand for disciplined service, a recognizable extension of the world he already knew. He had simply moved into a larger version of what York Cottage had always contained. His younger brother George presented a considerably more complicated case. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was born December 20, 1902. He was the most artistically inclined of the Windsor children, the most physically striking by contemporary account, and the most determined to live in ways that departed from the household's governing code. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, his behavior created substantial family anxiety. Drug use, specifically cocaine, is documented in multiple serious biographical accounts. His romantic life encompassed both women and men. His 19-year association with Noel Coward is confirmed in the biographical record, though biographers differ on whether the relationship extended beyond close friendship. Multiple press accounts characterized his life as scandal-filled, including affairs, drug use, and reports of illegitimate children. Queen Mary knew. Multiple biographical accounts confirm that the Duke of Kent's many peccadillos had vexed his parents over the years. The precise nature of the parental response isn't detailed in available primary sources, but the system's approach to what it couldn't accommodate is instructive. George wasn't removed from the household as Prince John had been. His lifestyle was managed by distance from formal attention, and his scandals were managed by the palace's habitual silence. The system had more than one tool for handling inconvenient truth. In 1934, he married Princess Marina of Greece. The press coverage was extensive and enthusiastic. Marina was beautiful, artistically sophisticated, and culturally interesting. Something in George's external conduct became considerably more orderly after the marriage, or at least considerably less visible. He was 31 years old and had spent a decade attempting various forms of escape from the world he had been born into. He died August 25, 1942, in an RAF crash in Scotland, at 39. Queen Mary, traveling home after attending his funeral, reportedly stopped the car to offer lifts to RAF personnel walking along the roadside, and spent the journey speaking with them about their lives and their service. The anecdote is cited consistently as evidence of her extraordinary composure in grief. It's also the portrait of a woman who had spent 80 years making private grief invisible, not because she didn't feel it, but because the alternative, the visible private grief of the Queen Mother in a royal car on the day of a son's burial, was simply not something her internal code permitted. Prince John can't be treated as a footnote. He was born July 12, 1905, epileptic from the beginning. His seizures grew more severe through his childhood years. At some point around 1909, he was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, separated from the main household, housed apart, in Charlotte Bill's care. The decision has been charitably read as providing the calmer atmosphere of the Norfolk countryside, rather than the formality of the principal establishment. It has also been read as concealment of something the family couldn't accommodate within its public presentation. Both readings may be simultaneously accurate, which is itself an argument about what this household's values were. The calm atmosphere was real. The capacity to remove him from visibility was also a consequence. Charlotte Bill, who had loved George and Edward and the others, cared for John with the same genuine attachment she had brought to all of them. She was there when he died, on January 18, 1919, following a severe seizure, on a Thursday afternoon at Wood Farm, at 13 years old. 3 of Queen Mary's 6 children would predecease her. John in 1919, George in the 1942 crash, and George VI in 1952. A 4th, Edward, abdicated and departed into permanent exile. She outlived the majority of what she had made. December 1936 is where the system was tested at its maximum stress and revealed its structure most clearly. Edward had been king for 11 months. His relationship with Wallis Simpson, twice divorced, American, incompatible in every constitutional sense with the role of queen consort, had been known within the family since at least 1935. George V and Queen Mary received Wallis at Buckingham Palace that year, and subsequently refused all further meetings. George V had told Baldwin in 1934 that the boy would ruin himself inside 12 months of the old king's death. George V died on January 20, 1936. The calendar was running. During the autumn crisis, Queen Mary chose not to confront Edward directly. She wrote in private correspondence that she had not liked to talk to David about his affair with Mrs. Simpson, in the first place because she didn't want to give the impression of interfering in his private life, and also because he was the most obstinate of all her sons. To oppose him over anything was only to make him more determined to do it. This is an accurate psychological assessment of her eldest son. It's also the account of a mother who had had 42 years to understand a particular dynamic and had never successfully modified it. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, Edward signed the Instrument of Abdication. The document exists in the National Archives, bearing his signature and, beneath it, those of his 3 brothers, Albert, Henry, George. All 3 had grown up in the same nursery, absorbed the same code, and were present in the same room when their eldest brother exercised the option the code had never formally acknowledged: refusal. When sympathy was offered to Queen Mary in the immediate aftermath, a mother whose eldest son had just surrendered the throne, she responded, "The person who needs most sympathy is my second son. He is the one who is making the sacrifice." Not Edward. Bertie. The one absorbing the duty the other had refused. This wasn't pretended indifference to Edward's situation. It was a complete and coherent institutional logic. The one who stayed inside the system deserved sympathy. The one who left it had made his choice. Her subsequent letter to Edward, cited in every major biographical treatment of the crisis, acknowledged the grief. "Our being parted and the cause of it grieve me beyond words." Then continued, "After all my life I have put my country before everything else, and I simply can't change now." She wasn't performing a position for the crisis. She had held this belief every day of her adult life. She was stating it plainly, in a personal letter, to a son she would never receive again. She never received Wallis Simpson. Not once in the 17 years between the abdication and her death in March 1953. She didn't attend Edward's wedding in June 1937. The New York Times, reporting on Pope-Hennessy's 1959 biography, described her response to the abdication in the biographer's own terms. "Abdication grieved Queen Mary. Official biographer says she scolded." Grief. Rebuke. Both simultaneously, without contradiction, which is exactly the portrait the evidence supports. Edward's most sustained documented grievance in the decades of French exile that followed was the family's refusal to grant his wife the title of Royal Highness and their refusal to receive her socially. He had wanted to bring Wallis inside the institution he had just left, and the institution, presided over by his mother, declined to expand its borders to accommodate her. He spent 36 years at a distance from everything he had grown up inside, and that distance organized most of his suffering as precisely as the institution itself had organized his childhood. What the Windsor household left behind wasn't a set of discrete injuries, but a set of permanently installed operating systems. George VI reigned for 15 years, through the Second World War and its reconstruction, through broadcasts he described privately as something he hated every time, through public occasions that remained physically taxing until the end. He stayed in London during the Blitz, when pressure existed to remove him to safety. Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940. He and Queen Elizabeth were present. His refusal to leave London during the German assault was both genuine courage and the Windsor Code in action. Duty required presence, so presence was provided regardless of personal cost. He died at 56. He had done everything the system required, and the system had required everything. Queen Mary died March 24, 1953, 6 weeks before her granddaughter Elizabeth II's coronation, at 85 years old. She had watched 3 monarchies fall, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, and attributed their collapse, on at least one recorded occasion, to their failure to separate personal indulgence from duty. The observation wasn't merely historical analysis, it was autobiography. She had spent 60 years making precisely this separation, and she wasn't wrong that the British monarchy had survived when others had not. The question her children's lives raises is whether the price was worth paying, and by whom, and whether the survival of the institution was sufficient compensation for what the institution cost those inside it. Elizabeth II, the granddaughter who received Queen Mary's conspicuous warmth, developed a public emotional reserve that served her through 7 decades of reign. The composure that attracted such admiration through most of her life, and that, in September 1997, attracted such criticism as inadequate to the national grief following Diana's death, was a Windsor inheritance, not a personal failing. A transmission, passed through George V and Queen Mary, refined through the logic of duty before feeling, and handed to the next generation as the family's most durable characteristic. Pope-Hennessy's 1959 biography remains the foundational account of Queen Mary's life because it does what the best biographical work does. It maintains respect for its subject and clarity about the damage simultaneously. The two coexist in his portrait because they coexist in the evidence. He had spent years in her world, reading the letters that gave very little away, meeting the courtiers and friends who knew her, and he concluded that she didn't find it easy to express her emotions, a quiet sentence carrying considerable weight. What the evidence supports is this: Queen Mary didn't fail her children through malice or through indifference. She failed them, to the extent that she did, through a complete and coherent belief system in which the crown's survival genuinely outweighed any individual need. This wasn't ideology imposed from outside. It was a worldview she had internalized fully enough that it organized everything she did: the formal visits, the letters about obedience, the collector's precision applied to objects rather than people, the abdication letter with its hierarchy stated in plain English. She wasn't cruel. She was certain. That is precisely the thing that made her terrifying to her children. Not violence, not indifference, but the absolute clarity of what she valued most. And the knowledge, communicated without words in every scheduled visit and every managed expression, that they knew what it was. Edward understood this and eventually walked away from it. Bertie understood it and built his entire life around accommodating it. Mary understood it and became precisely what was required of her, until she disappeared into usefulness. Henry understood it and found an institutional structure, the army, that expressed the same values in terms he could inhabit without visible cost. George understood it, spent a decade trying to outrun it through scandal and excess, found settlement when he stopped running, and was killed at 39 before the question could be answered more fully. John never had the opportunity to understand anything at all. Queen Mary's children weren't raised to be happy. They were raised to be royal. That distinction, which she drew with total conviction and no visible regret, shaped what each of them became and cost each of them something specific and irretrievable. The photograph still exists. The monarchy survived. Both of these things are true, and Queen Mary would have considered the second one the only one that mattered. Subscribe for more stories like this.